You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. It's not often scientists find themselves at the center of negotiations between enemies, but Siegfried Hecker isn't your average scientist. He goes by Sig, by the way. He grew up in Vienna at the end of the Second World War and moved to the United States when he was 13. Eventually, he became one of the world's leading nuclear scientists, which, much to his dismay, landed him in North Korea.
I didn't want to go to North Korea. I'd hoped to never have to be in North Korea. However, my good colleague from Stanford, John Lewis, invited me to come along.
John Lewis was a Stanford professor who pioneered an unconventional approach to diplomacy with the so-called Hermit Kingdom. In 2003, the North Koreans invited Lewis to tour their nuclear facilities, and Lewis needed an expert to join him.
That's when John called up, and I said, John, I've been in Russia, I've been in China, I've been all these other places. However, he was persistent, and I wound up in North Korea.
Sig was the former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the lab best known for building the plutonium bomb dropped on Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And during the final days of the Cold War, Sig collaborated with Russian and Chinese scientists to prevent a similar nuclear disaster.
And so we did experiments together, and then eventually we also did a lot of work together as to how you protect nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, etc. These indeed are great opportunities for the scientists, and in this case the nuclear scientists, to be able to actually understand what the other side is like. But of course I had to get approval from the U.S. government to go.
The Bush administration was worried that Sig's visit would be used as North Korean propaganda.
Nevertheless, in the Department of Energy, and one person in the Department of State at very high level thought, why not? Why not let Hecker go? He might learn something, because 2004 was a particularly difficult time in relationship with North Korea, in that they had withdrawn from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In that first visit to North Korea in 2004, they were incredibly forthcoming. They actually wound up touring through their nuclear facilities, holding their plutonium in my hand. Now, for all of those of you who might move back a bit, it was in a glass jar, it was sealed, and if you have plutonium in a glass jar sealed, it's not going to hurt you. So they actually showed me that much.
What Sig saw in the Yongbyon nuclear facility that day shocked him. He asked himself, how could one of the poorest countries in the world possibly muster the means to build a bomb? The North Korean scientists continued to invite Sig back over the years because they appreciated his earnest accounting of the visits, and they were eager to showcase a nuclear deterrent to the rest of the world. But all the while, their relationship with the U.S. was completely unraveling.
They basically told us, look, you don't know how bad things are going to get. They essentially told us they're going to walk away. Then in 2010 is when they actually showed us the second path to the bomb, the uranium enrichment centrifuge facility.
Even though North Korea was quickly making strides toward becoming a nuclear state, it still kept the door open for dialogue with the Obama administration. And Sig struggled with this. Why would North Korea engage the U.S. and continue to pursue the nuclear program at the same time?
What I finally figured out, that with the end of the Cold War, with Russia going different directions, China linking up with South Korea economically, that it might be just better to seek accommodation or normalization with the Americans. They had to try to do it from a position of strength. And that's where then this strategy of dual track is try diplomacy, see if you can reach normalization with the Americans, but at the same time, make sure you also develop the nuclear capabilities in case that doesn't work out.
In other words, North Korea didn't want to be caught flat-footed if nuclear negotiations fell apart, and they ultimately have in every successive U.S. presidential administration.
What they wanted from my visit was to show me enough, no BS, I mean, they really showed me a lot, and then have me conclude, boy, if they can make that piece of plutonium they can make the bomb. And in the end, that was the bottom line.
Over the last 2 decades, there were several moments for the U.S. to rein in North Korea's nuclear program. Sig calls these hinge points. Like in 2002, while George W. Bush was in the White House and decided to kill a landmark deal struck by Bill Clinton.
The Americans discovered that North Korea, while they were freezing plutonium path to the bomb, were exploring and developing the uranium path to the bomb. So what do you do about that? Well, what the Bush administration did is they walked away from the plutonium deal, and that was a very bad trade-off because they were definitely pursuing uranium enrichment, but it would take them another 10 years or so to get to where they can build a bomb. It was a disaster. That's what it was, because at that time they didn't have nuclear weapons.
North Korea's track record in nuclear negotiations with the U.S. has also been spotty. In 2012, just weeks after agreeing to a historic moratorium on nuclear development, North Korea scuttled the agreement by launching a satellite into orbit. A year later, North Korea carried out its third nuclear weapons test.
We are at the point today where North Korea is only one of 3 countries in the world that can threaten the United States with nuclear weapons, the other 2 being Russia and China. I mean, for heaven's sakes, how did we get there? I'm afraid today, as we sit here in 2023, that we've had a phase change, that Kim Jong-un and North Korea today is no longer interested in that accommodation with the United States. They've decided instead to switch back to Russia and to China. And I've worked with the Biden administration, and they show their frustration by essentially saying they won't answer the phone. So now it's going to take a complete rethink as to how we get back to actually dealing with North Korea.
This missed opportunity is still playing out today as Kim Jong-un continues to ratchet up North Korea's nuclear capabilities. In the month of March alone, North Korea had 7 missile launches. That's a level we haven't seen since 2017. And Kim's government demands the U.S. halt joint military drills with its allies in the region, like Japan and especially South Korea. The Biden administration has repeatedly told Pyongyang the door is open to resume long-stalled nuclear talks, but Kim has refused to engage. Joining me to make sense of this escalating tension is Dr. Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks, Ray. Good to be with you.
Dr. Cha, you and I have been having this conversation in various venues for well over a decade. And yet here we are at it again because things seem to be moving in the wrong direction again. What do you conclude about this latest escalation?
Well, it is quite worrying, Ray, and I think you're right. We've had this conversation before over the years, and the situation only seems to be getting worse. The biggest change was the new leadership, but that's not so new anymore. Really, what I think has fundamentally changed is there's a very clear conviction by North Korea that they not only want to be a nuclear weapon state, but a modern nuclear weapon state with all sorts of different capabilities in terms of missiles and nuclear devices.
Recently, they showed off some new hardware. It looked to be the delivery equipment for battlefield nuclear weapons. Do we know if they're operational? Do we know if they've gotten that far down the road?
I don't think we have concrete evidence that they've deployed battlefield nuclear weapons, but they've certainly talked about it. They've been very clear in their statements about their desire to achieve that capability. And they are, in their exercising now, they're showing more and more things that hint at that sort of battlefield capability.
These are the largest exercises for the U.S. and South Korea in years. What are they for? What's the goal? Are the U.S. and South Korea preparing for war, or just trying to show what a bad idea a war would be?
Well, I think in the end, the exercises are about readiness. And the purpose of readiness is to deter the other side from even considering carrying out any sort of violence on the Korean Peninsula. The exercises, as you know, were halted for several years during the Trump era when Trump made an agreement with the North Korean leader to stop exercising. That's not a good thing for peace on the Korean Peninsula because it means that the military readiness is not there and means deterrence is less credible. We've already seen in the war in Ukraine what happens when you have a military that doesn't exercise and they're put in the field. They don't perform very well. And so this exercising is in part about readiness. It's also about reassuring our South Korean and Japanese allies that the United States security commitment is strong and it's for maintaining peace on the peninsula.
That Trump-era gesture to the North Korean government, did it work? Did it create any daylight? Donald Trump was, in his own words, trying a new approach because other things hadn't worked. Did we win any concessions, any better behavior during the years he was in the Oval Office?
Unfortunately, we didn't. There was a period of time, a couple of years, where North Korea stopped the testing that we're seeing so much today. But at the same time, it didn't mean they were developing their capabilities. And as we have seen since the end of the Trump administration, they have leapfrogged in terms of their technology, particularly with regard to long-range ballistic missiles, as well as smaller miniaturized warheads that they could put atop a ballistic missile. The Trump summit was a gambit. It's something that had not been tried before. Perhaps it could have led to something if both sides were better prepared. The leaders were better prepared to have an actual negotiation, but they weren't. And it was a missed opportunity, and it's left us all for the worse.
Well, anytime the South Korean and U.S. militaries publicly demonstrate any level of coordination, it sets off the North Korean government. What are the demands being made now by Kim Jong-un's government? Or really, are we beyond that demand and counter-demand phase of the relationship, and they just do whatever they want and make sure we see it?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think, as you suggest, they do these things because they want something from the United States. And I think that may have been the case in the past, that they want negotiations, they want to be bought off, these sorts of things. But what's troubling about the current situation is they're doing all these demonstrations and they're really not interested in talks at all. They're not interested in talks with the United States. They're not interested in talking to South Korea, China, anybody. The only people they're interested in talking to are the Russians now because they're selling weapons to the Russians. But they're not really interested in talking. So it's not a diplomatic card that they're trying to play. It seems to me what they're trying to use is they're using the cover of the war in Ukraine and concerns about China's increased assertiveness across the Taiwan Straits as cover for continuing to develop their capabilities and making everybody get used to the fact that they're a nuclear weapon state.
Could there be domestic reasons for this? Is Kim so firmly ensconced in his job that he no longer has to worry about other nodes of power and influence? He no longer has to show his fangs to other people in North Korea.
There's always a domestic driver of these foreign policy actions. I think Kim is pretty secure in his leadership. The caveat there is he could die tomorrow and we wouldn't be surprised. He could get shot tomorrow and we wouldn't be surprised. But I think he outlasted everybody's expectation when he took over this job and was not really prepared for it. And he's ruled ruthlessly. He's killed members of his family, of his extended family. He's purged a lot of generals. He's done a lot of things to try to show everybody who's in control. And so that certainly seems to be the case now.
Since the country is so insular, so sealed off, so opaque in a lot of ways, it's almost like the 21st century version of Kremlinology. You see where people are standing at the May Day parade and you try to read the tea leaves. It seems like his sister is more out front these days. It got a lot of comment. It got a lot of notice. Appropriately so, or was it being overread?
No, I think everybody was intrigued when his younger sister started playing a larger role. She was certainly present during the Trump summit. She was present during the summits with the South Koreans. And it gave one a sense that she was sort of Kim Jong-un's most trusted confidant, most trusted associate, which would make sense given that she is a direct member of the family. The other person that we've seen lately has been the daughter, Kim Ji-hye, the not even yet teenage daughter, who he has been parading around actually quite often, and at a lot of the weapons displays, which is a bit bizarre. Most of the time we take our kids to a baseball game or to a soccer game. We don't take them to an ICBM launch, but there seems to be some meaning behind that display as well.
The U.S.-South Korea military exercises, the exposure of new hardware by the North Koreans, all this is going on while tensions are already rising between the U.S. and China. Japan is rearming, or at least uparming, and promises to do even more. North Korea has been kind of an irritant to Beijing and also has relied on Chinese to run diplomatic interference when the various Kims get themselves into a tight spot. It's a tough neighborhood.
Yeah, it is a tough neighborhood, and it is true. I mean, I think what you just described, the war in Ukraine, greater Chinese assertiveness in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, in the Yellow Sea, as well as in the air around all of these countries, has created a much more unstable external and security environment for many of these countries. And so they are balancing. They are internally arming up. The Japanese are doing it. The South Koreans are doing it. The Taiwans are doing it as well. And that creates an environment in which it's very hard to try to convince North Korea to disarm when everybody else is building up their capabilities in the region, partly related to North Korean behavior, but also related to what's going on in Europe and what's going on across the Taiwan Strait.
From what you see, is the United States taking a holistic view of the situation you just described rather than trying to have discrete policies that pick off these countries one at a time and look at our approach, bilaterally instead of multilaterally?
I think that what is driving all of our Indo-Pacific policy now is the competition with China. As the National Defense Strategy says, China is the pacing threat for the United States. And that is really driving everything. So our focus is right now on building up Taiwan's ability to defend itself, trying to make clear to the Chinese that they don't want to get in a situation like the Russians are in now in Ukraine. But as a result of the attention, the focus is not really on North Korea as they build up these capabilities. In addition to that, China and Russia are not willing to help. In fact, they're willing to block any efforts in the UN Security Council to try to take action against North Korea. So it leaves the United States in a very difficult position where about the only thing that we can do is continue to exercise and build up our capabilities with our allies, because there don't appear to be any diplomatic paths that are open right now.
I'm no expert, but from the outside, it looks like Kim Jong-un is not the most reliable partner. He's a guy who you may put your eggs or some of them in the basket and just not know what you're getting.
I think that's right. He's not reliable. The Chinese always never found him reliable. But, North Korea they're making the best of the current situation. So they have a relationship with China, but they're really trying to use the opportunity of the war in Ukraine to cozy up to Russia. They need food and they need all sorts of other resources because they're just coming out of their 3-year COVID lockdown right now. And Russia needs munitions. They need ammunition. They need weapons. And so the North Koreans are appearing to sell a lot of small arms and weaponry to the Russians. They're both benefiting from this relationship in a way that's not good for the United States and its allies.
What about China? Xi Jinping is said to be a leader who values stability and predictability and longitudinal effects of policy. What's the state of the North Korea-China bilateral?
I don't think it's very good. It's been locked down because of COVID, both the COVID lockdown in China and the COVID lockdown in North Korea. I don't think Xi Jinping has any particular love for North Korea. He needs it in the sense that he doesn't want it to collapse so that he gets a U.S. military ally in a united Korea directly on its border. And they benefit economically from taking the minerals out of North Korea. But as you said earlier, they're not a reliable partner. And every time they do missile tests or nuclear tests, everybody blames China. So I don't think the Chinese have any love for North Korea at all. But as I said earlier, I think the North Koreans understand that, and they're really focused on trying to take advantage of Putin as much as they can, given Putin's needs right now.
Of course, the regional player that has to be on its toes all the time is South Korea. And there's been a lot of freeze and thaw cycles as South Korean governments look for glimmers, signs of hope about normalizing relations. Then things go into the deep freeze again. This would seem to be a freeze cycle that we're in right now, no?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a freeze cycle. The government in South Korea is a conservative government. not as enamored with giving everything possible in terms of engagement with North Korea for small progress in diplomacy. There isn't any dialogue taking place between the two sides. I don't expect there will be any time soon.
And as far as the United States is concerned, now that they are so far in the rearview mirror, can we see any better, any more clearly, what American efforts at containment have done, whether they've worked at all? Why Elder Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush efforts to keep North Korea from going nuclear all didn't work.
I think that's right, that none of these policies over the past 30 years have worked, even though the politics of it made them sound like they were all different. If you step back and look at it, the United States has been remarkably consistent in terms of what it has tried to offer North Korea: political normalization, economic assistance, food, security assurances to get them to give up their nuclear weapons. Actually, remarkably consistent going from Elder Bush all the way to Biden. But these have all failed. And the failure is evident in the increasing tempo and development of their capabilities. And it's really put the administration at a loss at what to do now. We tried expert working level negotiations. I was part of those when we did the six-party talks in 2007. Trump tried the other approach, was to go leader to leader. And so neither of those things worked. So I think people are really at a loss of what to do next. And meanwhile, the North Koreans are taking advantage of the time to consolidate their position as a nuclear weapon state.
One remarkable aspect, as I've covered this story over the years, is that the North Koreans, no matter how much trouble they're in, always manage to not play the supplicant. There were times when famine was widespread, where there were constant rolling blackouts, really disaster and suffering, but they always managed to somehow play their hand as if they're an equal at the table, rather than somebody with their hand out or a tin cup out. And they've refined that into a weird kind of power.
Yeah, I think that's right. I remember, I think it may have been a New Yorker cartoon years ago that had a picture of North Korea with a gun to its head, and it said, "Feed me or I'll shoot myself."
Well, there you go.
There you go, right. And I think that's right. I mean, they are masters at playing a weak hand. But I think at the core of it are two things. One is that countries on the outside want to help. Like, this is a country that needs help, and they want to help. And at the same time, there's certain parties like China and Russia that don't want to see North Korea collapse. So we want to try to disarm them and also help the people. And China and Russia don't want to see bottom line is they don't want to see North Korea collapse. So North Korea's weakness becomes a strength. Everybody is trying to prevent instability from occurring, and they've been very good at playing that card.
Looking back at the recently completed U.S.-South Korea project, what are tabletop exercises, and why did your organization, CSIS, recommend having them?
So these are exercises basically to test different scenarios, contingencies, also to try to get a good sense of how countries will react in a military contingency. We think that these things are important because they do help to ensure the credibility of extended deterrence, the U.S. nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. And they also demonstrate that the two sides are ready, that there is clear planning and readiness that is being measured every time we do these exercises. Again, the example to look at is the poor performance of the Russians in Ukraine. And that's what happens when you have a military that doesn't do field exercises, that doesn't do tabletop exercises, that don't do computer simulation exercises. That's what happens. And I think rightly, the United States is never going to allow its forces defending in Northeast Asia ever to deteriorate like that.
So is the value, if I understand, to theorize at the tabletop level and then see on the field if the ideas are workable? Or do you save time by not doing it in the field because the things you're noodling around the table become less or more advisable?
There's no substitute for field and live fire exercises, which is something that the United States and its allies can do in Korea. When you don't do them, as was the case during the Trump administration, You do try to do computer simulations and tabletops to try to make up for that, but there's no substitute for the field and live fire exercises. And it's good that those are now been resumed and that we're in the midst of one right now.
CSIS has also advised, I understand, putting nuclear weapons in South Korean soil and waters. Why? Given the unpredictable nature of the government in the North, doesn't it seem like a risky move?
No, I think it is a risky move. And to put a finer point on it, what we recommended in our report is that the US and South Korea and Japan consider doing nuclear planning exercises. So giving the South Koreans and Japan a better sense of how we think about nuclear planning. And then we also recommended what we called pre-decisional working level discussions on the prerequisites for returning tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. So that's government speak for basically saying no decision on returning nuclear weapons to Korea. But if one were to think about doing that, what would be the things that we would need to have prepared for that in terms of storage facilities, nuclear safety and security, these sorts of things. So if anything, it's not even a half step. It's more like a quarter step in the direction of returning tactical nuclear weapons. And that's largely because we have to acknowledge that the security situation is changing and that there are concerns, among South Koreans that the United States needs to sort of shift course or do more.
Is part of that planning trying to game out in your own heads what the reaction in the North would be?
Yes, of course. And that is the hardest part. So often the exercising is about what the three allies would be doing in response to different types of North Korean responses. But it's very hard to actually predict what North Korea would do because it is one of the most unpredictable countries in the world. What made the Trump administration's policy so dangerous at times was that they thought they could count on North Korea being rationally deterred if the United States carried out limited military strikes on North Korea. For a country that for 50 years we've said is irrational, we can't expect them to be rational when we give them a bloody nose, if you will. But that's what the purpose of these exercises are for. And of course, the hardest question to answer is how the North Koreans respond in these different scenarios.
If you were to take a first-time reader, just pulling out a map of East Asia and trying to understand what's going on, how would you explain the resilience of the Kim dynasty? They haven't delivered anything like affluence, comfort, stability, safety, very little. In fact, at the time when the two Koreas were getting going, they were roughly equally on similar economic footing, and now South Korea is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and North Korea is an economic disaster zone. Why is there a third-generation Kim on the throne?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wrote a book a while ago that was titled The Impossible State, in the sense that North Korea really is an enigma. It's very hard to explain. The Soviet Union collapsed, East Germany collapsed, much of the Eastern Bloc at the end of the Cold War, and yet Romania. And yet North Korea stood there by itself for all this time. I think part of the answer is that the people are so suppressed, they are so put upon that they're just trying to survive. They're not looking for revolution. It's difficult to contemplate revolution when you're just looking for your next meal. And I think that certainly is part of the reason in terms of internally. And then externally, I think part of it is a function of geography. You have this small country that's tucked up in China's and Russia's southern flank, right on the border with Russia and China. And that geography has worked to North Korea's advantage in that the Chinese and the Russians don't ever want to see that buffer, if you will, from U.S. military allies in South Korea and Japan. They don't ever want to lose that buffer. And so for that reason, Russia and China have made sure that North Korea does not collapse, even though they haven't made it prosper. They just do enough to ensure that it doesn't collapse. So this combination, I think, of the accident of geography as well as the internal suppression of any free spirit in North Korea is what has allowed the regime to continue as long as it has.
It's a klepto state. It's a hacker's state. It's a smuggler's state. It's an odd little place. Is geography all really that keeps it from being just another Moldova or Albania? Is it only because it's such a complicated neighborhood that North Korea matters at all?
I think that's right. I mean, the Korean Peninsula itself has been often described as the Poland of Asia. It sort of sits right at the intersection of the interests of the four great powers in Asia: China, Russia, Japan, and the United States. And so for this reason, on the one hand, anything that happens on the peninsula engages the interests of all four countries. On the other, changing the status quo becomes very difficult because somebody's going to lose out there among those four countries, and they're not going to want that to happen.
How come a richer, more formidably armed, more self-confident China hasn't found it either necessary or desirable to bring North Korea to heel?
Well, I think they have always wanted to try to promote economic reform in North Korea. They've always tried to tell the North Koreans, be like us, right? Allow more market economy in the country, but maintain political control. So they've tried to do that for decades, and the North Koreans just have not been interested because they're mainly interested in maintaining the rule of the family more than anything else. But at the same time, China's not willing to abandon North Korea. By no means are they willing to abandon North Korea and allow the country to be absorbed by the South and allow the South Koreans, or United Korea, which would be democratic and pro-US, having that directly on their border. So the Chinese, they know what they don't want on the peninsula, which is they don't want unification under the South. And we know what they do want in North Korea, which is more economic reform, but they don't get that from the North Koreans. They just get bad behavior, missile testing, cyber hacking, cryptocurrency stealing, these sorts of things. But at the same time, they can't abandon the North Koreans because they don't want to lose that buffer. So it's a dilemma for China. There's no denying that.
Because there must be some middle ground. I mean, look at the Central Asian states. None of them are model democracies in any sense, but they aren't necessarily the kind of bloodthirsty, beyond norms, sort of renegade states, systematic abusers of human rights at the scale of little North Korea.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's where I think the cult of personality leadership of North Korea really comes in and is an important factor that distinguishes the North Korean state. They believe that the Kim family must lead. They will never do anything that will lead to potentially releasing forces in North Korean society that could be independent of the state. I've always said that in many ways, it's better to have a military dictator, a secular military dictator in North Korea, than it is to have this cult of personality leadership, because military dictators, even though they would be autocrats and could suppress human rights, can think rationally about economics. But this North Korean cult of personality family leadership, they can't think rationally about economics. And so for that reason, they're not open to the sort of economic reforms that's needed to save the country.
I always enjoy talking to you, but I wonder if we're just going to have this conversation again in another 2 years or 3 years. Can you see beyond the current state of play, a sort of plausible set of possible outcomes? What are we looking at in the near future?
I mean, in the near future, there's nothing really to look forward to, unfortunately. I think they're going to continue to demonstrate that they have a modern nuclear weapons force. I think their desire is to have a nuclear arsenal at least the size of smaller nuclear weapon states like France and Britain, and establish a position where nobody could question them or try to undermine their stability. The good side, the upside, the glass half full aspect of this is that the United States will continue to consolidate its relationship with its two key allies in Asia, Japan and South Korea. And that's the core of our position in Asia. That's good for dealing with North Korea. It's good for dealing with China. But in terms of any sort of near-term resolution to this standoff, unfortunately, I'm afraid I don't see any coming soon, and I just see tension increasing. Where it ultimately goes, hopefully, is not to any sort of conflict, because all sides are kind of mutually deterred at this point, but it will still be a very uncomfortable and not very well settled environment for all the countries in the region.
Victor Cha is the Senior Vice President for Asia and the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's the author of Power Play, Origins of the American Alliance System in Asia, and his soon-to-be-released newest book is Korea, A Modern History. Great to talk to you, Dr. Cha.
Thanks, Ray. It's really a pleasure to be with you again.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Matteo Schimpf, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Our associate producer is Sienna Barnes. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.